Have you ever noticed that life has a strange way of whispering to you before it starts shouting? At first, it's subtle, a feeling you can't explain, a restlessness that won't go away, a quiet voice inside asking, is there more than this? Most people ignore it. They distract themselves. They stay busy. They convince themselves that someday, somehow, things will magically change. But what if someday is today? What if the sign you've been waiting for has finally arrived? Not tomorrow, not next year, not when everything is perfect, right now. Because the truth is, the sign was never going to appear as a flashing message in the sky. It wasn't going to come from a stranger, a prediction, or a miracle. The sign arrives when you begin to see clearly. It arrives the moment you become tired of running from yourself. It arrives when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the fear of changing. And maybe that's why you're here listening to these words. Maybe life has been placing signs in front of you for months, perhaps even years. The relationship that taught you a painful lesson, the opportunity that disappeared, the door that unexpectedly closed, the feeling that something deep inside you is ready to awaken. What if none of those things were mistakes? What if they were invitations? Invitations to stop searching outside yourself for answers that have been waiting within you all along. Today, we're going to explore one of the most powerful teachings on awakening, awareness, and inner freedom. A teaching that reminds us that the life we've been chasing may already be closer than we think. Because sometimes the breakthrough you're praying for doesn't come as a reward. It comes as a realization. A realization that you don't need another sign, you are the sign. And the moment you truly understand that everything begins to change. Have you ever noticed something strange about the most caring people in your life? They rarely ask for much. They don't demand constant attention. They don't keep score. They don't walk around reminding everyone of everything they've done. In fact, the people who give the most are often the ones who speak the least about their sacrifices. And that's exactly why so many people fail to recognize their value until it's too late. An empath has a unique way of moving through the world. They notice what others miss. They sense pain hidden behind forced smiles. They hear the sadness concealed within ordinary conversations. They pick up on emotional currents that most people walk past without ever seeing. Because of this, they naturally become the listeners, the helpers, the supporters, and the healers in countless relationships. People are drawn to them because they provide something rare, a sense of being understood. The problem begins when what was once appreciated slowly becomes expected. At first, it seems harmless. Someone reaches out during a difficult time, and the empath is there. Someone needs advice, and the empath listens. Someone is struggling emotionally, and the empath offers comfort. Day after day, month after month, year after year, they continue showing up, not because they're seeking recognition, but because helping others is part of who they are. But human nature has a tendency to normalize what is consistently available. Think about it. The things we see every day often become invisible to us. The sunrise happens every morning, yet most people barely notice it. The people who consistently support us can suffer the same fate. Their presence becomes so reliable that we stop appreciating it. We begin assuming they will always be there, no matter how little effort we invest in return. An empath can feel this shift long before anyone says a word. They notice when conversations become one-sided. They notice when people only call when they need something. They notice when their struggles are overlooked while everyone else's problems take center stage. They notice when they spend hours understanding others, yet nobody takes a few minutes to understand them. And here's what makes it difficult. They often excuse the behavior. They tell themselves people are busy. They tell themselves everyone is carrying burdens. They convince themselves that things will improve. They continue giving because their heart naturally leans toward compassion rather than judgment. But every relationship creates an emotional record. Every interaction leaves an impression. Every act of appreciation or neglect accumulates over time. Most people think an empath leaves because of one major event. That's rarely what happens. The truth is much quieter than that. The decision usually begins forming long before anyone realizes it. It develops through hundreds of small moments that seem insignificant when viewed individually, but become impossible to ignore when viewed together. It's the unanswered messages, the broken promises, the lack of gratitude. The constant expectation that they will understand everyone else while nobody tries to understand them. Each experience adds another piece to a picture they can no longer deny. What's fascinating is that empaths are often among the most patient people you'll ever meet. They can tolerate situations that others would have abandoned long ago. They see potential where others see failure. They see wounds behind harmful behavior. They understand people act from fear, insecurity, and pain. This understanding allows them to stay longer than most, much longer. Sometimes far longer than they should, but patience should never be mistaken for weakness. Compassion should never be mistaken for unlimited endurance, and kindness should never be mistaken for permission to take someone for granted. There comes a moment when the empath begins asking questions they have avoided for a very long time. Why am I always the one reaching out? Why am I always the one understanding? Why am I always the one making sacrifices? Why does this relationship only seem to function when I carry the emotional weight for both of us? These questions are powerful because once they appear, they are difficult to silence. The empath starts observing instead of assuming. They stop focusing on what people say and begin paying attention to what people do. And what they discover can be painful. They realize some people have become attached not to them, but to what they provide, the support, the attention, the reassurance, the emotional labor, the constant availability. In other words, they realize they are being valued for their usefulness rather than their humanity. That realization changes everything. Because every empath eventually reaches a point where they understand that giving without receiving is not love, it's depletion. Supporting others while neglecting yourself is not noble forever. Eventually, it becomes self-abandonment. The moment this awareness awakens, something inside them begins to shift, not dramatically, not loudly, quietly, very quietly. They start protecting their energy. They become less available. They stop chasing conversations. They stop forcing connections. They stop explaining their worth to people who should have recognized it already. And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They interpret the empath's silence as weakness. They assume the empath will return like they always have. They believe another apology, another excuse, another promise will reset everything. But they fail to understand that the empath they knew is no longer operating from the same place. Something has changed. The person who once tolerated imbalance has begun recognizing their own value. The person who once accepted crumbs has started questioning why they settled for so little. The person who once poured endlessly into others has finally realized that they deserve to receive care too. By the time outsiders notice the distance, the empath has often been processing the decision for months, maybe even years. What appears sudden to everyone else is actually the final stage of a long internal journey. They've replayed conversations. They've examined patterns. They've given countless opportunities. They've waited for change. And eventually, they arrive at a simple but life-changing truth. Their kindness was never meant to be exploited. Their understanding was never meant to excuse disrespect. Their compassion was never meant to become a permanent resource that others could consume without gratitude. So they stop, not out of anger, not out of revenge, not because they hate anyone. They stop because they finally understand that protecting their peace is not selfish. It's necessary. And when an empath reaches that realization, something remarkable happens. The energy that once flowed endlessly toward people who took them for granted begins flowing back toward themselves, toward their healing, toward their growth, toward relationships where appreciation exists naturally rather than being constantly requested. And that's why so many people are shocked when an empath disappears. They expected another chance, another conversation, another warning, another opportunity. What they didn't realize is that the warning signs had been there all along. The empath was speaking through exhaustion, through disappointment, through silent hurt, through countless acts of patience that were never fully appreciated. The tragedy is that many people only recognize the value of an empath after their absence creates a space nothing else can fill. Only then do they understand what was lost. Only then do they see how much emotional warmth, stability, and understanding that person brought into their life. But by that point, the empath has often learned the lesson they needed to learn. And once they truly learn it, they rarely go back to places where their kindness was treated as something ordinary instead of something precious. There is a wound that doesn't leave bruises. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't create dramatic scenes that everyone can see. Yet, for an empath, it can be one of the most painful experiences imaginable. It happens when their feelings are repeatedly dismissed, ignored, or treated as if they don't matter. And the dangerous part is that most people don't even realize they're doing it. An empath lives in a world of emotional awareness. They don't simply hear words, they hear the meaning behind them. They don't just notice actions, they notice intentions. They pay attention to the pauses in conversations, the changes in tone, the energy in a room, and the emotions that people try to hide. Because they naturally spend so much time understanding others, they often assume that same understanding will eventually be returned. At first, they are willing to be patient. When someone misunderstands them, they explain themselves. When their feelings are overlooked, they give the other person the benefit of the doubt. When they feel hurt, they don't immediately react with anger. Instead, they try to communicate. They try to create clarity. They try to build understanding. That's because empaths don't usually want conflict. They want connection. They want honesty. They want to feel that the people they care about are genuinely willing to see them. But over time, something begins to happen. They start noticing a pattern. Every time they express a concern, someone tells them they're overreacting. Every time they share a feeling, someone tells them they're too sensitive. Every time they open their heart, someone minimizes their experience or changes the subject. And while each individual moment may seem small, the emotional impact accumulates. Imagine carrying a backpack. One stone by itself doesn't feel heavy, neither does the second or the third. But eventually, after enough stones have been added, the weight becomes impossible to ignore. Emotional invalidation works the same way. The empath keeps carrying these moments, not because they want to, but because every dismissal sends a message that says, your feelings are less important. A message that says, your perspective doesn't matter. A message that says, what you're experiencing isn't real enough to be acknowledged. And no matter how strong a person is, hearing those messages repeatedly begins to affect them. The strange thing is that empaths often blame themselves before they blame anyone else. They wonder if they're expecting too much. They question their own emotions. They replay conversations in their minds, trying to determine whether they were unfair. They spend hours analyzing situations that other people forgot within minutes. Not because they're weak, because they genuinely care about getting things right, because they value harmony, because they want to understand before being understood. But eventually, a painful realization starts to emerge. The issue isn't that they're being misunderstood occasionally. The issue is that they're being misunderstood consistently. There is a huge difference. Everyone experiences misunderstandings from time to time. That's part of being human. But when someone repeatedly dismisses your feelings, ignores your concerns, mocks your vulnerability, or treats your emotional reality as an inconvenience, something deeper is happening. Respect is beginning to disappear. And empaths can feel that loss of respect long before anyone says it aloud. They notice when people listen only long enough to respond. They notice when conversations revolve around everyone else's emotions while theirs are treated as irrelevant. They notice when their pain becomes a joke, an annoyance, or a problem that others don't want to deal with. The difficult part is that many empaths continue trying to fix the situation long after they should stop. They explain themselves again. They choose different words. They become more patient. They become more understanding. They give more chances. Because deep down, they believe that if someone truly understood how much they were hurting, things would change. But there comes a point when they realize the problem isn't a lack of explanation. The problem is a lack of willingness. Some people aren't failing to understand because the empath communicated poorly. They're failing to understand because they've already decided not to listen. And that realization changes everything. Because once an empath understands that their emotional truth is being dismissed intentionally or repeatedly, they stop fighting for validation. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually the effort begins to fade. The enthusiasm disappears. The emotional investment starts shrinking. What once felt like a deep conversation becomes a surface-level exchange. What once felt like vulnerability becomes silence. And here's what many people fail to recognize. Silence from an empath is rarely the beginning of the problem. It's usually the final stage of it. Before they became quiet, they tried. Before they withdrew, they communicated. Before they detached, they cared enough to keep reaching out. The silence arrives when they realize their words are no longer landing anywhere meaningful. Think about how exhausting it must feel to repeatedly share your heart with someone who responds as if your emotions are an inconvenience. Think about how draining it becomes to constantly explain your pain to people who are determined not to see it. Eventually, self-protection takes over. The empath begins preserving their energy, not because they no longer care, but because caring without being heard becomes emotionally unsustainable. There is a moment in this process that is particularly powerful. It's the moment they stop seeking permission to trust their own feelings. For years, they may have relied on others to validate their experiences. They may have needed reassurance that their emotions were legitimate. But eventually they realize something important. Their feelings don't become valid because someone agrees with them. Their feelings are valid because they are real. That understanding becomes a turning point. The empath no longer needs constant confirmation from people who have repeatedly ignored them. They stop defending every emotion. They stop justifying every hurt. They stop arguing for the right to feel what they feel. And with that comes a level of emotional freedom that many people never expect. Because once an empath starts trusting their own inner voice, the opinions of dismissive people lose their power. The comments that once created self-doubt begin losing their influence. The invalidation that once caused emotional confusion begins revealing itself for what it truly is. A reflection of the other person's limitations. Not a reflection of the empath's worth. This doesn't make the experience painless. The disappointment remains. The sadness remains. The grief remains. After all, it's painful to realize that certain people were never willing to understand you as deeply as you understood them. It's painful to recognize that some relationships survive only when one person suppresses their truth. But pain has a way of teaching clarity, and clarity changes behavior. The empath begins choosing different environments, different conversations, different relationships. They start spending more time with people who listen instead of dismiss. People who ask questions instead of making assumptions. People who create safety instead of judgment. And perhaps the most surprising part of all is how quietly this transformation happens. There is often no dramatic announcement, no final argument, no emotional explosion, just a gradual withdrawal from places where their heart was never fully welcomed. The people around them may not even notice at first. They may assume everything is normal. But the empath knows something fundamental has changed. The endless effort is gone. The constant explaining is gone. The emotional chasing is gone because they have finally learned a lesson that took years to understand. A heart that is repeatedly ignored will eventually stop knocking on closed doors. And a person who spends their life making others feel seen will eventually choose to walk away from anyone who refuses to truly see them. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming that an empath will always stay. They see their patience, their understanding, their willingness to forgive, and they begin to believe those qualities have no limits. They assume that because the empath didn't leave after the first disappointment, they won't leave after the 10th. Because they were forgiven once, they'll be forgiven forever. Because the empath understands human flaws, they'll continue accepting behavior that slowly damages the relationship. But what many people fail to realize is that an empath's greatest strength can also create the greatest misunderstanding. Their compassion is often mistaken for endless tolerance. Empaths understand that people make mistakes. They know that everyone carries wounds, fears, insecurities, and unresolved struggles. They know that sometimes people say things they don't mean. Sometimes they act out of pain. Sometimes they make poor decisions that hurt those they care about. Because of this understanding, empaths are often willing to give chances that other people would never consider giving. When someone apologizes sincerely, the empath wants to believe them. When someone promises to do better, the empath hopes they will. When someone explains their behavior, the empath naturally tries to see the situation from their perspective. This ability to understand multiple sides of a story is one of the reasons people are drawn to them in the first place. But understanding someone and trusting someone are not the same thing. And this is where many relationships begin to unravel. Trust is not built through words. It is built through consistency. It is built through actions repeated over time. Every promise kept strengthens trust. Every act of honesty strengthens trust. Every moment of reliability strengthens trust. Trust grows quietly, almost invisibly, through repeated evidence that someone values both the relationship and the person within it. The problem is that trust can be damaged much faster than it can be built. A broken promise may last only seconds, but the doubt it creates can remain for years. A betrayal may happen in a moment, but the consequences can echo through countless future interactions. An empath understands this deeply because they invest emotionally in the people they care about. They don't simply trust with their minds. They trust with their hearts. They allow people into parts of themselves that are protected from the rest of the world. They share vulnerabilities. They share fears. They share dreams. They share pieces of themselves that cannot easily be taken back once revealed. Because of this, betrayal affects them differently. It's not only about what happened. It's about what the event represents. When trust is broken, the empath begins questioning things they once believed were certain. They wonder whether the connection was as genuine as they thought. They wonder whether the loyalty they offered was ever truly reciprocated. They wonder whether the relationship they invested so much energy into was built on something real or something imagined. At first, they fight against these thoughts. They don't want to believe the worst. They search for explanations. They search for context. They search for reasons to hold on. That's because empaths often value relationships deeply. They don't abandon meaningful connections over small problems. They don't throw people away because of a single mistake. In fact, they often work harder to repair broken relationships than anyone else involved. But every betrayal leaves a mark, even if forgiveness is offered. Even if understanding is given, even if the relationship continues, a mark remains. And when those marks begin accumulating, something important starts happening beneath the surface. The empath begins paying closer attention. They stop focusing entirely on potential and start observing reality. They stop listening only to promises and begin measuring patterns. Because patterns reveal truth in ways that isolated events never can. Anyone can make a promise. Anyone can apologize. Anyone can say the right words. But patterns reveal intentions. Patterns reveal priorities. Patterns reveal character. An empath who has been hurt enough eventually learns to trust patterns more than explanations. And this is where many people become confused. They think the empath suddenly changed. They think the empath became cold. They think the empath stopped caring. But what actually happened is much simpler. The empath stopped ignoring what they were seeing. They stopped making excuses for behavior that repeatedly caused pain. They stopped convincing themselves that tomorrow would automatically be different from yesterday. They started accepting reality exactly as it was. And reality can be difficult to face when it contradicts hope. Hope is powerful. Hope keeps people invested. Hope keeps people waiting. Hope keeps people believing change is just around the corner. But eventually reality becomes louder than hope. The repeated dishonesty becomes impossible to overlook. The repeated disappointments become impossible to justify. The repeated betrayals become impossible to reframe. At that point, the empath faces a choice, not between staying and leaving, but between self-respect and self-sacrifice. Because every time trust is broken and ignored, a person is forced to abandon a piece of their own intuition. They must silence the voice inside them that recognizes the truth. They must pretend not to see what is clearly visible. And empaths can do that for a while. Sometimes for a very long while, but not forever. Eventually they become exhausted, not from the betrayal itself, but from carrying the emotional weight of pretending everything is okay. There is a unique kind of exhaustion that comes from continuously giving chances to someone who continuously proves they cannot be trusted. It drains emotional energy. It drains hope. It drains the belief that things will improve. The empath begins realizing that forgiveness and access are two different things. You can forgive someone and still create distance. You can understand someone and still walk away. You can wish someone well and still recognize they no longer belong in your life. This realization is often one of the most difficult lessons they ever learn. Because empaths naturally want to heal relationships. They naturally want to repair what is broken. They naturally want to believe in the best version of people. But eventually they discover that some relationships cannot be healed by one person alone. No amount of understanding can compensate for repeated dishonesty. No amount of patience can compensate for repeated betrayal. No amount of love can compensate for a lack of trust. And when this truth finally settles in, the empath begins changing. Not outwardly at first. Internally, quietly, the emotional attachment weakens. The expectations disappear. The constant effort fades away. The relationship that once occupied so much space in their heart begins losing its hold. This process is often invisible to everyone else. The empath may still smile. They may still be polite. They may still show kindness. But something essential has shifted. The trust that once connected them has begun dissolving. And trust, once fully lost, is incredibly difficult to restore. Because trust is not rebuilt through promises. It's rebuilt through proof. And by the time an empath reaches this stage, they have usually heard every promise imaginable. What they need now is evidence. What they need now is consistency. What they need now is something stronger than words. Unfortunately, many people realize this too late. They continue offering explanations when accountability is needed. They continue offering promises when action is needed. They continue offering excuses when change is needed. And while they're talking about what they intend to do, the empath is quietly observing what they're actually doing. That observation eventually creates certainty, not anger, not revenge, not bitterness. Certainty, the certainty that trust cannot survive where honesty is absent. The certainty that loyalty cannot survive where respect is missing. The certainty that peace is worth more than staying connected to someone who repeatedly breaks what they claim to value. And once an empath reaches certainty, something remarkable happens. The internal struggle ends. The endless debating ends. The constant questioning ends. They no longer wonder whether they should stay. They no longer search for reasons to justify the pain. They no longer chase explanations. Instead, they simply move forward. Quietly, calmly, without drama, without a grand announcement. Because the final stage of losing an empath rarely looks like an emotional explosion. It looks like silence. It looks like acceptance. It looks like someone who finally understands that protecting their heart is not an act of cruelty, but an act of wisdom. And that some doors close not because love disappeared, but because trust did. And perhaps that's the lesson most people learn too late. An empath does not leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they cared for too long without being met halfway. They leave because their kindness was mistaken for weakness, their patience was mistaken for permission, and their forgiveness was mistaken for an unlimited supply of chances. The truth is, an empath rarely walks away after the first disappointment. They stay, they listen, they hope, they try again. They believe in the good that still exists beneath the mistakes. They search for reasons to hold on long after others would have let go. But every heart has a limit. Every soul reaches a point where self-respect becomes more important than saving a relationship that only one person is trying to protect. And when that moment arrives, the empath doesn't usually announce it. They don't gather an audience. They don't seek revenge. They simply choose peace over chaos. They choose healing over heartbreak. They choose themselves. The most surprising part is that many people never realize the value of an empath until that value is gone. Only after the phone stops ringing, only after the support disappears, only after the understanding they relied on is no longer there do they begin to recognize what they lost. Because some people don't understand the warmth of sunlight until they're standing in the cold. And some people don't understand the value of a genuine heart until that heart is no longer available to them. So if you have an empath in your life, appreciate them while they're present. Listen when they speak. Respect what they feel. Protect the trust they've given you. Don't assume their loyalty guarantees their permanence. Nothing valuable should ever be treated as guaranteed. And if you're the empath listening to these words, remember this. You were never meant to carry everyone else's burdens while ignoring your own. You were never meant to earn love by sacrificing your peace. You were never meant to stay in places where your kindness is exploited, your feelings are dismissed, and your trust is repeatedly broken. Your compassion is a gift, but it is a gift that deserves protection. Because the people who truly belong in your life will never require you to abandon yourself in order to keep them. Now here's something worth thinking about. What if the people who walked away weren't the greatest losses of your life? What if the greatest loss was every moment you abandoned your own worth just to keep someone else comfortable? And what if the moment you finally choose yourself isn't the end of your story? What if it's the beginning of the life you were always meant to live? If this message spoke to you, don't ignore the feeling it created inside you. Sometimes the quietest truths carry the greatest power. And sometimes the sign you've been waiting for isn't coming tomorrow. Maybe it's the realization you're having right now.